Okay, it's a great pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm delighted that a few people in the world are interested in the postal history of Natal. I, of course, am fascinated by it. I want to thank Colin Fraser for inviting me to come and talk to you guys about it. We're going to talk about a British colony, and I didn't want to take anything for granted. So this is a map, which wouldn't be a current map. This is a map of the parts of South Africa that were at one time or another independent states. So the Cape Province, of course, was a British colony, so was Natal, and that's what we're going to talk about. And then the Transvaal and Orange Free State were independent Boer republics, and they'll come into the story of Natal because in their early days their stamps were only valid for postage within those countries, and there are very rare combination letters which use the stamps of two countries, so Transvaal Natal, Free State Natal, but I'm getting ahead of myself because we'll get to there later on. So I thought I'd start off just with a little bit of history. There won't be, everything's going to be about stamps and postal history, but here's a little bit of proper history. Why is it called Natal? Well, Natal actually means birth, and it was because of the famous Portuguese explorer who was the first one, in fact, to go round the Cape all the way to what eventually became the Dutch East Indies, was off this part of Africa, unexplored, in 1497 on Christmas Day. And of course that's in Portuguese, Natal is the name for Christmas. So he named the land Natal, and that stuck. 400 years later, almost 330 years later, was settled by a handful of Europeans at the port. The original people had actually been shipwrecked there. But this was essentially hostile territory. It was territory of a very powerful nation, the Zulu nation, and there were in the next 20 years very few Europeans settled there, and virtually all fled in 1838 when the Zulu king actually massacred a delegation that had come to negotiate him giving them land. And I'll come back to that story in the next slide in a minute. But as a result of that, there were a series of battles between the Boers, who were Dutch ancestry individuals who had moved away from the Cape, and they had moved into this area. That's why they had come in conflict with the Zulu. And so they had a short-lived republic just for 2 years in the 1840s, and then the British invaded, and it became part of a sub-colony, a protectorate of the Cape Colony in 1844. But then from a stamp point of view, became more interesting because it became a separate colony in 1856. And the first stamps, which were very primitive embossed stamps, were issued in 1857. So we'll get to them in a minute, but I just thought I'd show you this because it has a US connection as well. This is the only letter known from Natal before that massacre in 1838. I said there were very few people there, so much so that we actually know exactly who this person was. The woman who wrote this letter, Sarah Champion, was possibly the only European woman living in Natal, certainly inland Natal. Her husband was the only American missionary who was working with this Dingaan chief. And they were actually warned of the massacre and able to flee. This letter is from 1836. His letters are all in an archive, and there's a book that describes his letters, and it's in this archive. But the archive weren't interested in his wife's letters, so I was able to buy this letter. I mentioned that there was this war, this battle where the British came up and conquered Natal from the Boers, and so this is the only known letter from that campaign. It's an officer's letter and makes interesting reading. The officer who wrote it is asking for a loan of several £100 because he thinks by virtue of them having won the battle that he's going to be promoted from captain to major. And one of the ways the British kept ordinary people out of their officers' class was that you had to buy your own uniform. Several £100 was required. If you couldn't afford a uniform, you couldn't become an officer. Anyway, I did a bit of delving into the history of this guy, and he was still a captain several years later in India, so he wasn't promoted. But anyway, from a postal history point of view, it's quite a nice early letter. The postmark there is postmarked in transit from Cape Town. So if we now get into Natal postal history itself, I only have one pre-stamp cover that I'm going to illustrate. I'm illustrating it because of this oval here. This is the rarest pre-stamp postmark of Natal. The post office postmarks, there were two sent out. The one was the capital, so they say post office. The capital is called Pietermaritzburg. You'll see that in later issues. And that's a well-known postmark. But this is a smaller town, Ladysmith. There was apparently one sent out for Durban as well, which is the third city in Natal. And that is only found on forgeries. So it was never postally used, but someone must have found it lying in a drawer and used it later on forgery. So unfortunately, there's no provenance to the use of the Durban cancel. But this is a very rare cancel. It says here there are only 4 examples known. And in the pre-stamp period, these prepaid markers were sent to the 3 big towns at Pietermaritzburg, Durban, and Ladysmith. And this is, in fact, the only known use of that prepaid marking. And so it's used in conjunction. So it's really 2 very rare markings together. So I'm now going to go on to the stamps themselves. And they were very primitive. You know, with wishful thinking, we could say these are in the same kind of class as the cotton reels. These are very primitive stamps that were produced locally by a printer in Natal. The printer's name is here, May and Davis in Pietermaritzburg. Essentially, they took bits of colored paper and embossed the stamp onto them and put gum on the back. I'll make a couple of points here. There are 4 stamps. You don't have to memorize the colors because I'm going to show you all 4 in this presentation. The problem was that these very stamps and the very paper, so the dies existed and the very paper that was used for them was subsequently reprinted about 30 years later. And so from a collecting point of view, it essentially destroys mint stamps as a collectible of this issue because there's really no way to tell the difference between a genuine mint stamp, which would have been struck in 1857, and one that was struck in the 1870s. King George V asked the Postal Administration Natal for examples of these mint stamps. In about 1900, they sent him some things they had, but I've looked at them, and there's no way that you can really say for sure that they're genuine. They look just like the reprints which are around. So the only way to collect these embossed stamps is used with known genuine postmarks and, of course, on cover. And so we'll go through a little bit of that. So this is the sort of thing that they look like. That's just a picture of the die. And so it has Natal, Victoria, Regina, a crown, and then the 4 values. You need to know a little about the rates. So the rate of postage in Natal at this time was threepence. And so there were 4 stamps. The threepence stamp is the most commonly used because that was the single rate of postage. There were not an awful lot of uses other than that. So the 4 stamps were threepence, sixpence, ninepence, and a shilling. And so the higher values would be for a double rate, triple rate, or a quadruple rate. And those rates are pretty rare. The only other use for the stamp, because these early embossed stamps were not valid for postage outside of Southern Africa, was they did accept them used to the Cape or to these Boer republics, and the rate of postage there was sixpence. And so sixpence stamps are the second most common to find on cover, and we're not talking a lot of covers here. There's probably 30 or 40 known sixpence covers. When you get to the ninepence and the shilling, they're all great rarities, and I'll get to them. Now, so these embossed stamps were embossed on bits of paper, and the embossing machine was such that once you did a row of your embossing, so you would have embossed a row of stamps, then if you wanted to do the next row, the piece of paper would have come closer to you and you would have done a second row. We don't know how big the sheets were, but at some point you would have had a problem because the piece of paper would have had no more space. So you could turn the thing around and then do the next row. So theoretically, at least, all the values would exist in what we call Tete Beche, which means two stamps pointing in different directions. And so it's not that easy here, but this stamp has a crown over here and Natal written at the top there, and there's Natal written on the other side. There's the crown, and that's threepence in two directions. So that's a Tete Beche stamp. So as I said, this should theoretically exist on all four of these values. The reality is, however, that of the sixpence, there's one known pair that exists used, and it's not Tete Beche. Of the ninepence, there's one known pair used, and it's not Tete Beche. And of the shilling, there's one block of four known, and it just also happens to be not Tete Beche. So the only Tete Beche known is on the commonest value, the threepence, and it's probably just because there's no material around. As I said, of the top three values, there's one multiple each of those three values recorded today, and that's it. Nothing else exists. So then the threepence, there are actually 7 of these Tete Beche recorded. As it says up there, 3 of them are in private hands. I'll show you all 7. This is the only one that is on a letter, and it's on a front. This is a well-known correspondence. The Dean of Pietermaritzburg means the Bishop of Pietermaritzburg, and this correspondence was from Pinetown. And in Pinetown at that stage, there was no councillor. As I said, there were only the 3 councillors in this early period: the capital, Pietermaritzburg, the port, which was Durban, and then Ladysmith. I showed you that Ladysmith oval earlier. So letters from smaller towns were routinely hand-cancelled in this kind of fashion. So that's cancelled with a cross, and that is the only known Tete Beche on letter, and arguably is the greatest item of Natal postal history, although there's one that would compete with it that I'll show you in a minute. Just for interest, I said there were 7 altogether, so that was 1. There are 6 more. Here are the 3 of them. The one on the left here is in the Taplin collection at the British Library in London. This is the only one, and it's really not that legible here, but this is the Pietermaritzburg post office cancel. I showed you that oval cancel of Ladysmith. This is the only one of those Tete Beches with the Pietermaritzburg cancel. This is a circular cancel, just says Natal, and it's a cancel from Durban. And then this is the one that's in the Royal collection, which was in the Ferrari collection. So that gives us 4, and then the final 3 of over here. This is in the Durban Museum in South Africa in the Hearst collection. This one is in the Royal collection, which was donated by Mann in the 1950s. So that's at the Royal Philatelic Society in London. And this is the only other one in private hands. So that's so much for the threepence. We're going to go now to the sixpence. And I didn't put a picture in here. I said there was only one pair known, and I do own it, but it's not in this show. Arguably, the most interesting thing of the sixpence is that, in fact, there are a handful of covers known with bisects. This one here is from the Burris sale. I have no idea where it is. Hasn't been seen since then. I suspect it's somewhere. This one in the Taplin collection in the British Library is not ideal because it's not tied over the bisect. And that's the subject here. So this is, again, one that is not tied over the bisect and is, in fact, is in the Royal Philatelic Society forgery collection based on that. I'm not 100% sure it's a forgery. It's the right rate because threepence was the right rate, but you know, and it may just possibly have been that the cancel was oriented at that it tied it that way, but not tied over the bisect makes it hard to certify that as genuine. The known examples, and there are about 6 of them known, are all these triangular bisects. There is one square bisect which is just on a piece, which I'm showing you over there. So we've looked now at the threepence, particularly the Tete Beche, the sixpence. Do the 2 stamps exist together? Well, indeed they do. There are 4 letters known with a threepence and a sixpence. This is one that I particularly enjoy. It's a military letter. It was written at Fort... Oh, oops, sorry, I didn't want to go forward. It was written at Fort Napier and addressed to Fort Scott. And it's 3 times the local rate. So there's the threepenny stamp and the sixpence stamp. I mean, one of the great frustrations of collecting these embossed is that the stamps really are not attractive. I mean, a little bit of colored paper on a piece of paper, but you grow to love them over time. And when I was first offered this, I thought, well, you know, it's got accounting written on it. It's an extraordinarily rare item. And then there's all this writing over the stamps themselves. But it turns out that that adds to the charm of this cover. What this actually says is patrol after Bushmen. So this letter was actually sent, was mailed in the bush, and this cancel, the Pietermaritzburg cancel, is actually a transit cancel. So it was sent from this Fort Napier, cancelled with the notation patrol after Bushmen from this military captain who mailed it, and then it went on to Fort Scott. So that's a combination of 2 values of the embossed. We move up to the 9pence. The 9pence, there's 1 pair known. This is it. Again, it's not much to look at. There are only 3 copies of this stamp known on letter. So 2 of them are shown here. This is in my collection, and it's the only known pair. This is in the Man collection, which, as I said, was donated to the Royal Philatelic Society in the 1951. And that's a 9pence stamp. And we'll get to the 3rd one in a minute. The shilling then, again, is the same kind of color as the threepence, but these, believe me, are 2 shilling stamps. And that was very rarely used. This is a 2 shillings and sixpence franking, which would be a 5 times weight. In fact, it's a registered, so it's actually 4 times plus sixpence for registration. And then this is arguably perhaps the other greatest cover of Natal. This is the only block of 4. I mentioned there's a block of 4 of the shilling. And just for good measure, there's a 9pence on it as well. So this is a extraordinary 19 times the usual rate. It's addressed to Goodrick, who was a lawyer, and the biggest frankings of this period are all on this correspondence. And I think that as a lawyer, people were sending him material from estates and whatever, so a lot of material. And so this is truly an extraordinary franking. I'm actually going to be exhibiting it in Monaco later this year, and it's the only block of 4 of any of the embossed stamps. It happens to be the top value, the shilling, and then, as I said, it's this extraordinarily huge rating on the outside of a parcel. Now, you would think that it would be the end of the embossed, because those are the stamps were issued 1857. And I'm going to move on to the next issue in a minute, which are really beautiful Chalons heads printed in London by Perkins Bacon. But they actually ran out of penny stamps twice in Natal later on. So this is now 1859. It's 2 years later. And the Chalons heads are already in use, and they have a penny and a threepence. And they order the wrong stamp, or the order gets mixed up. Natal orders a penny because they're running out of pennies, and they get threepenny stamps. And so what they did was they went back to say, well, okay, we'll issue a provisional. And so these are again embossed stamps, but this time 1 penny. And the use of a penny, I told you the rate of postage was threepence. So what was a penny used for? Well, the 2 main usages were newspapers. Newspapers were actually sent free within the colony by mail. But if you wanted to send a newspaper to the UK, and these are all addressed to England, it cost you a penny. And so this, in none of this stuff is common, but in fact, if anything, you can find these. There are about 20 known of these newspapers. And all 3 of these, for instance, are used on the 6th of September 1859, which is the earliest known date of use of that particular stamp. For the blue penny, what is rarer than the newspaper is one of the other uses that you could use for a penny stamp which most postal historians would know what it would be, and that's for soldiers' letters. So British soldiers at this period, instead of paying sixpence, if you were not an officer, you could send your letter as a soldier's letter. There are 4 known of this soldier's letter. 2 of them are in museums, these 2, and then these 2 are in my collection. So the blue penny on soldier's letter is a nice thing to find. And then 2 years later, they run out of penny stamps again, and this time they do the same thing. It's a penny stamp again. It's hard to see, but on this buff colored. And these are great rarities, rarer than the blue pennies. So there's only 1 known on a newspaper, and it's that one. This is out the famous T.V. Roberts was a famous collector of letters with hand cancels, pen cancels on items around the world. So he had this. There's only known example of that stamp on a newspaper. This is the only known combination. That's a Natal penny stamp. This is the one that they'd run out of, and then these are 2 of these embossed. And this is a kind of a frustration to a collector like me, because I told you that man donated his collection to the Royal, and that was in 1951. This is 10 years after he died, and I'm not entirely sure, one day I'll get to the bottom of this, whether it was actually the Royal themselves that bought it for their own collection to add it to the man collection, or whether in fact it was man's children who bought this item from the sale and then added it to the man collection. So this is now also out of the domain of collectors in a sort of museum collection, but it is the only known example of a combination of the embossed with the subsequent stamps with the Chalons. And then the last one I want to show on the embossed is this remarkable piece. These are threepenny stamps, and these are pennies. And this is a picture from the Stamp Lover in 1910 of what the original thing looked like. And it has 3 threepence, and it has, if you count them, 9 pennies. And so at some point, the cover was severed after this point here, after those. So those 3 stamps are those 3 stamps. And one of my quests is to try and find the missing stamps. And I have found one of them, but not all the rest. So somewhere, these used penny embossed, and because I have this picture, I can compare them to them, and maybe I'll complete that cover again. Okay, so now we're on to a different ballpark. If you collect Natal, you're forced to collect these rather ugly early embossed stamps, and then you come to possibly, arguably, one of the most beautiful stamps ever produced. These stamps were used for a variety of British colonies, and there were 3 values: 1 penny, threepence, and sixpence. Now this doesn't project quite as nicely as I'd wish, but if you look, these are die proofs obviously, and if you look at the penny and the sixpence, the surrounding area around the Queen's head is completely clear. If you look at the 3 pennies, it's not clear. So these are in fact not final dies. These are progressive dies, and I've never seen a final die of the threepence. And in fact, there are 2 versions of this proof. There are 4 corners here, so I've blown up this top left corner of this die, and you'll see there's a central dot with 4 dots around it. And in this die, there are lines joining those dots. So that's kind of minutiae, but it's different dies of this progressive die proof. And again, these dies are extraordinarily rare. To my knowledge, this is the only set of the 4 dies that exists. Now, if you love early Perkins-Bacon issues, then you may have heard of this cancelled by Perkins-Bacon, the whole scandal that occurred when Perkins-Bacon sent out 6 stamps to the postmaster and his family, and they actually ended up losing their contract for printing British Commonwealth stamps because of this. The stamps were not theirs to dish out. So what they did was it was as a gift, and they took a block of 6 of virtually all the stamps that they printed across British colonies. So there are, I don't know, maybe 50 or more countries, and they used this cancellation. And these have become huge rarities because although the stamp itself, I mean, a used copy of this penny stamp you could buy outside for, you know, $10. To get them with this cancelled marking, there are only 6 stamps known, and they were just the set of 6 that were distributed. What we have here is that there's a fabulous book written by the best collector of these in private hands anyway, Jaffe, who published this book. And so he had records of these 3 of the penny. The left-hand one here is in the Royal Collection. The Queen of England has the best collection of these cancelled by Perkins Bacon stamps. This is in the Mann collection that I've referred to a few times. That's in the at the Royal Philatelic Society. And then this one is, at the time that he printed the book, the only one known in private hands, which was out of the Hart collection. It sold in the 1990s. So I was at home in South Africa many years ago before I came to the States. And I get a phone call out of the blue from George Holshauer, who may be well familiar to you guys, big pipe, British Commonwealth dealer in California. And he says, Klugman, have you got cancelled by Perkins Bacon penny? I thought, oh my God, he's found this Hart stamp. And I say no, and we reached an agreement, and he sent me a picture, and it wasn't that stamp at all. It was this one. And of course, what's beautiful is that I could line it up just as I've done here and show that indeed it's position 5. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These 2 stamps are still unknown, whether they still exist or not. But there are now 4 known examples of this stamp. There's also the threepenny stamp exists with this cancelled. There are only 2 known, and they're in the Royal Collection and in the Hart Collection at the Royal. So they're none in private hands. So in fact, the Gibbons catalogue now just has a notation saying if you think you have one of those, they're none in private hands, so you've got the only one. If you find it. I still, of course, have a fantasy one day that on eBay I'll see one of these and pick it up. But yeah, thank you. There's very little in this part of the world of sort of provisional stamps, or postmaster provisionals don't exist. This is a very interesting item from just south of Natal. There was no postal service south of Natal at that time, and there was one trader, and their name was Goodliff and Balance. And they decided to offer a postal service for people there into Natal, and they produced this stamp, which had a 1 penny value. You can find them occasionally. There's one with a cross on it, which is the only known used. None are known on letter, unfortunately, and there's this one sheet that exists of this provisional. There is a pair of Natal Chalons stamps cancelled with the with this oval, which says Goodliff and Balance. So this may have originated on a letter. They would have had to put Natal stamps on the letter for them to be postally used in Natal. But again, you know, one of the things that you look for there are those who claim to have seen a Goodliff and Balance letter. I have never seen it. None have been illustrated in an auction. So at the moment, I'm not entirely sure that they actually exist. So now I'm going to jump forward to 1869, and that's important because in 2019, it's the 150th anniversary of this issue. And for those of you who may be members or fellows of the Royal, I've actually written up a whole article on this 1869 overprint, which is coming out next month, I believe, in the London Philatelist. It's a complicated story. So essentially the Natal stamps, if I go back and just, oops, that's the wrong way. I'll go back here. If I go back and show you, this is what the stamps looked like. And you'll see they say Natal, they give a value, but they don't say anything about postage. So in fact, these stamps could be used for postage or revenue purposes. And so in 1869, they decided they wanted to separate the accounts of the post office from the revenue services, and they decided to overprint their stamps postage. And they did it locally. And this is man's view of what the sheet looked like, and it's about the best that we have. And what makes it complex is you'll see there's numbers on this sheet, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 different overprints. They all say postage, and they're described here. So type 1 has a capital P of postage, and the overprint is 12 3/4 millimeters long. You have to actually measure it. Type 2 is the same word, but the longest version. This is 14.5 to 15.5. There was a time when the 14.5 and 15.5 were separate. Now they're lumped together, and so they have different Stanley Gibbons designations. And just to make things, he's numbering them from the top to the bottom of the sheet. So there's the type 1s, these are the type 2s, type 3 is in the middle, and just to make it complicated, we're not going from smallest to middle to largest. That's the shortest, 12 3/4. Then the longest one is type 2, and this is 13 3/4 in the middle, so type 3. This is the rarest of all of them, and the numbers in the sheet are listed here. So there's 72 of these, 28, 20 of these, and then 60 of the last. So these are all capital P, postage with a full stop. This one here, this doesn't look anything like that. I'll show it to you in a minute. It's all block letters. So this is a capital P, this is capitals, all of them with a full stop. And then they're tall capitals for the type 5. I will say that I've been able to add 2 bits to Mann in terms of the scholarship. He was not sure what this stamp is. I'm going to show it to you in 2 pictures time. We now know that this is also a type 2, which is the longer one. And so you can get what you call a setenant stamp. You can get a stamp which is 2 different varieties. They're extraordinarily rare. There are 2 in the Royal collection. I have 1, and there may be 1 other out there. What I've also been able to show is he has this blank line here. I was able to procure a block of pennies that fits, in fact, goes down to that line, fits over that space. And we know that, in fact, this was also type 4. In fact, in his assumption of the numbers, he assumed that was also type 4. So these 1869 overprints are very, very hard to find mint these days. The rarest of the mint are the shillings. And this is just a picture of the top one. This is type 1, so that's the postage with the shortest. That's 12 3/4 millimeters. What I find useful is that, in fact, the 12 3/4 millimeters is the width of the picture here. So if the postage, if you move this up at its widest point, that so if I just look at them, I can tell which is the 12 3/4. So this stamp, in fact, 2 copies only exist in private hands. Both were in the Ferrari collection, and I list where all the others are. So that's the one area that's really sought after with these 1869 overprints is the mint shillings. The other is to try and find the setenant. And so this is actually a letter, and that it's hard to just see, but that is the longest version of the stamp, the 14.5 to 15.5 millimeter. And then these 2 are the 13 3/4. So that is that position 100, and that's 101 and 102. And this is the only example known of that strip with the setenant, and happens to be on a letter. I said these shillings are rare mint. Well, this is the rarest you can get. This is the only one known. So there's, of this type 5, which is the tall capitals postage, there's only 1 example known of the mint stamp, and that happens to be that one. Another great rarity, if you're looking for 1869 overprints, is to find them used with stamps of other issues. So this is, again, in the Mann collection, a remarkable franking different coloured stamps to Aden. This is a later issue. You can't really see, but there's a postage overprint in a circle there. That was done in London. So this is a later shilling. And so the 1869s, these are all various 1869s used in combination with an 1870 shilling. And then there's one, this is an 1869 overprint used with the 1870 penny, and this is also overprinted in London. This was illustrated on the back cover of the Heart Sale. I mentioned the Heart Sale. And then I've just done a census now of the known letters, and I mentioned to our Beche specialist that there are 7 of them known to the Tati concession. That's in what's today Bechuanaland. There are a couple of very rare destinations there. The commonest destination is to the UK. And again, if you'd like to send me one next week, I'd appreciate it. There are no known examples of this issue to the United States. So if one came up, that's a great rarity. Moving on, 1870, the next year, instead of relying on these various local overprinted postage, De La Rue, who are now printing the stamps, actually produced postage overprints on the next set of stamps they sent off from London. This postage should be in black. The postage there, sorry, should be in green. The postage is, and it's a lousy choice that, to do a green overprint on a green stamp. But for some reason, and we believe these were probably printers' proofs that were somehow left in the shipment. And so they're only known used. And the red, they exist in red and black. On the red, there are 8 recorded, all are used, and 6 of them are in private hands. There's two of them that I own. This one, actually, Her Majesty decided to raise some money and sold some of the material from the Royal Collection. They bought a beautiful cover with, I think, 10 penny blacks on for £10 million or something with the proceeds. But anyway, I was able to get, it's nice to have a provenance ex the Royal Collection. And then the black overprint you can just barely make out there is, again, it's a rare stamp. They're only all used. There are 15 recorded, and 1 is on a letter, which happens to be on this letter. Moving on, they did another shilling with, again, an overprint, this time overprinted locally. And in fact, this is a proof sheet of that local overprint setting, which the late Benny Illman from South Africa found heaven knows where. But it was in his sale of his collection. And these are the 2 largest multiples mint and used known of that later shilling. So now I'm going to get on to the question of, towards the end, of these combination usages. I mentioned at this early period, 1870s, that Transvaal stamps only paid for postage in the Transvaal. They were not valid outside. The vast majority of Transvaal combinations went down from the Transvaal through the Free State or the Cape. So Transvaal used with Cape or Free State stamps, I wouldn't say they're common, but they probably exist in the 10s or 50s or 100s. There's a mountain range between the Transvaal and Natal, and you've got to get over it, and it's not easy. So there was much less mail went through Natal. I wrote this paper a good few years ago now of all the known examples. So there are 18 letters that are known of Transvaal. There's again the Transvaal 6p postage, just paid for the Transvaal postage to get to Natal. And I'm illustrating 3 different postal uses. So the packet rate before 1876 was a shilling. So there's a Natal shilling stamp. There was an opportunity to send letters by ship letter, which was less reliable, but at a lower rate, 4p. So there's a 3p and a penny Natal stamp there showing the ship letter rate. And then from the 1st of August 1876, the rate went to 6p, whether you sent it by packet letter or ship letter, and there's 2 threepence for a 6p rate. So the 3 different rates of postage used in combination with these Transvaal stamps. Now, rarer still is combination with the Free State. The mountains are higher if you go down to the Free State than they are from Transvaal to Natal. The only known usages are all from small towns close to Natal in the Free State. These are the only 3 letters that are recorded. They're a little later too, 1879, 80. And again, the same story. Free State stamps were only valid for use in the Free State. And occasionally letters would go across and be mailed from Natal. And you can see the 6p rate for the Natal postage at this later period with a 4p and 2 pennies. One interesting thing, this is a little getting on now into the 1880s. This is Natal postage stamp change in colors and perforations. And on this appendix sheet, there are a couple of these items which are perf 12. And so the only perf 12 of Natal, in fact, are proof stamps that existed on this one appendix sheet. There are a couple that exist in the Royal Collection. Other combinations, there was a short-lived Boer republic called the New Republic. You may have seen these stamps, very primitive local stamps as well. And like Transvaal and Free State, they were only valid within their own little Boer republic. About half the material went through Natal, the other half went through the Transvaal, so you can have, these are all Natal stamps used in combination with the new republic. And this is, an entertaining thing to look for. Coming right towards the end here, I only have a couple more slides. This was a fascinating story. It had nothing to do with Natal itself. There was a revolution in Madagascar against the French in 1895, and the French blockaded the port. So there's no letters coming in and out. And so the British consulate in the capital produced their own stamps, 2 issues. There's one, Madagascar Inland Mail stamps they're called. And they invited the local missionaries, anybody who wanted to send a letter, to actually buy these stamps, and then they arranged for these letters to go from a small unblockaded port called Vatomandri, and there was a ship that went from there to Natal, and the deal was that if you paid for these stamps, they would, this is 2 shillings and 4 pence, they would affix Natal stamps for you when the letter arrived in Natal and post them on. And this is actually quite remarkable, because the guy who wrote this letter actually wrote a book. He was a journalist of the Times, and he wrote a book which I have, and on the day before he mailed this, it says in the book, I'm sending the last letter that I can before the French arrive, because the French invaded eventually, and that was the end of all of this. And so this is the largest franking, 7 times weight. So his dispatch was obviously bulky, and the normal rate of postage now, we're in the 1890s, was, this is UPU, tuppence halfpenny was a rate of postage from Durban to London, and that's a 7 times rate. The rate of postage that they wanted was 4 pence for their local service to Vatomandri, and there's a 5 times rate. Second last thing I wanted to show you, this is straight postal history. It's not strictly Natal stamps. This is a brief period between 1888 and 1893 in Durban, where there was this ship letter marking used for ship letters coming into Durban from anywhere pretty much around the Indian Ocean. And I really love these ship letters. I've written a couple of articles about them. And what's nice is that you can get them from all sorts of places. From the Australian states, there's one known, it says down here, from Victoria. There's one known from Tasmania. I'm just showing you 2 examples. This is a particularly attractive item coming out of early Rhodesia through Mozambique, and then with the ship letter marking. I almost felt guilty when I bought this cover, because the least interesting thing you could argue about it is the Natal ship letter marking. It's a great combination of Mozambique and Rhodesia. In fact, I allowed myself to swap it for a Natal item, so it now resides in in hopefully a great Rhodesia collection that's being built in the UK. But here is again from Madagascar, the British Mail, an earlier period. British Inland Mail was in the 1895. This is 1888. British Mail from Madagascar via Mauritius through Durban with the ship letter. And then finally, just to finish, I thought I'll show you again something that I was sort of instrumental in working out how it all happened. So this is an overprint. There was a shortage of halfpenny stamps in 1895, and these are 6-penny stamps, overprinted, as you can read, postage halfpenny. And in the catalogue, the stamp exists missing the word postage. And I found this block for sale and bought it some years ago with the top left stamp missing postage. And then I realized there was another block, which I unfortunately didn't own. But it was an illustration of it. And I realized that the 2 may fit together. And in fact, this block came up for sale this year in the Besançon collection. I was able to acquire it, and indeed these 2 fit perfectly together. More than that, this is the top row of the sheet. So the explanation of this missing postage almost certainly is that there was a fold down of the margin here. So if this, if the margins folded down when it was printed, then it was, the postage was probably on the back of that fold down, and that explains how the postage got missing on this, where clearly the rest of the overprint is there. So that's just speculation, but those are the only two examples of that stamp with the missing postage. So I've taken you on a long journey from 1836 to the end of the 1890s. The story of Natal doesn't quite end there. There's a whole area of specialization around the Boer War, which is 1899 to 1902. That's outside the scope of this. And then there were some Edward stamps issued, and Natal ended in 1910, became part of South Africa. But I'm obviously fascinated by all of this, and I'm absolutely delighted that you guys came to came to listen to this. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has. Yeah.
Do we know what the width
of the selvage was? Yeah, I think it's probably similar to what you see on the left there, but it may be less than that. There are full sheets of this particular overprint. A lot of speculators bought it, and I actually think that the selvage on top is about half the width of what you see on the left, which, yeah, what didn't go as well. No, I think the sheets that I have seen, in fact, it's a good point. I'll have a look at them. I have a sheet of this. The sheets bottom and top, I think, are cut much closer than on the side. So that probably explains why it just took off the top postage. Yeah. These stamps actually do exist also with the overprint sideways, which is a bit sort of weird. And then there are some very rare double postage overprints. The first postage very, very faint, so you have to look very carefully. But it's interesting because there are very few Natal stamps that are widely available in large multiples. But because these were only a half a penny each, and because speculators knew, I mean, this stamp, unoverprinted, because this is the same stamp that was overprinted in 1869. So this is a revenue stamp that had been around for 30 years in Natal, and there were very limited stocks of it. So they used up what they had in doing these halfpenny overprints, and you could buy a sheet, you know, for 50 pennies or whatever, a sheet of 100, or maybe a sheet was 120. So, you know, it didn't cost much money. So speculators bought all of this up, so much so that they ran out. This was issued on the 12th of March, 1895. By the 18th of March, they were all gone. And they then overprinted another stamp, but this time a very common penny stamp, which there were millions of available. And so the speculators couldn't buy all of those. So this is ironically one of the very few stamps of Natal you can still find full sheets today. Good. Well, thanks for your attention.